Hello? I will need your advice. Imagine being in a relationship for a long time where you felt worthless, where you were constantly belittled, and your attempts to do everything right were simply ignored. And then, just as you start to feel like you can't endure it anymore, everything suddenly changes. Can you really forgive when betrayal becomes so obvious? And is it worth trying to rebuild what has already been destroyed? This is a story about my struggles, about how I changed, and about how hard it was to let go of the people I loved. This is not just another story about betrayal. It's a real journey through pain, disillusionment, and, ultimately, a choice. Watch, and I hope you'll share your thoughts. I work as a security guard at a nightclub in a small town in Ohio. It's not a job I chose, but it pays the bills. My wife, Emma, always made it clear that she wasn't satisfied with my position. Her words were like sharp needles that left marks on my soul, even when I tried not to pay attention. Emma was a smart, ambitious, and charismatic woman who easily attracted the attention of others. We got married 6 years ago, and back then, I believed our life would be perfect. She had dreams, I had stability. We promised to support each other no matter what. But over time, that promise turned into empty words. Emma worked at a law firm as a paralegal. Her career meant everything to her, and she always despised my lack of ambition. "You could have been somebody," she would say whenever she saw me in my security uniform. Those words often came after she returned home from corporate meetings, where everyone wore expensive suits, and I looked like a guy off the street. Our house also became a symbol of our marriage. From the outside, it looked solid, but inside, everything was falling apart. In the evenings, Emma would usually sit with her phone, scrolling through social media or texting someone, while I tried to occupy myself with my own things. Conversations between us became rare and filled with sharp words that were hard to ignore. I always tried to avoid conflict. My childhood taught me to keep everything inside and remain silent. My father drank often, and I would hear his yelling at night from my bedroom. My mother always endured it, and I, too, decided that patience was what saved a family. But in our case, silence became the language we used to avoid the truth. Emma started spending more time away from home. "I have a meeting," she'd say, or, "I'm staying late with the girls." Every time, I felt a cold stone of suspicion in my chest, but I could never muster the courage to ask her directly. One night, she came home late, her perfume mixed with the smell of alcohol, and there was a strange smile on her face. "You could at least ask me how my evening went," she tossed as she walked past me to the bedroom. I started drinking more often. My shift ended at 2 in the morning, and before going home, I would stop by the bar next to the club. At first, it was 1 drink, then 2. Alcohol dulled my thoughts, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. But every time I returned home, I was met with the same coldness. One day, sitting at the kitchen table, I looked at a photo on the shelf. It was of Emma and me on our wedding day. Her smile was genuine, and my eyes shone with happiness. Back then, we believed we could build our forever. But now that forever felt like a myth. Emma no longer wore her wedding ring. When I asked about it, she simply shrugged. "It gets in the way when I'm working." That night, I realized we were no longer partners but 2 strangers just living under the same roof. That was only the beginning, but even then, I felt that this path would lead us to disaster. I just didn't yet know how deep this abyss would go. I started noticing details I used to overlook. The sudden phone calls Emma would take in another room. The new dresses that appeared in her wardrobe without explanation. Her phone, which was never left without a password. All these little things added up to one big picture, but I was afraid to look at it directly. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The club was quiet, and my boss told me I could leave early. When I walked into our house, I heard her laughter. It was the kind of laugh she no longer shared with me. It was coming from the kitchen, where the lights were dimmed. I stood in the hallway, clutching my keys, afraid to walk in. "Oh, it's just a client," she said when she noticed me. Her voice was overly cheerful, overly confident. On the table sat a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. The second one was half empty. The client was already gone. I wanted to ask why this client had stayed after work, but the words got stuck in my throat. I just nodded and went to the bedroom. That night, I couldn't sleep. After that, these moments started happening more often. She spent more time at work. And when she came home, she looked as though she had been at a fancy restaurant, not an office. One time, I dared to ask if everything was okay. Her eyes, cold and sharp, stared into me. "What do you want to hear, Jake? That I'm tired? That your lack of ambition exhausts me?" she said with a hint of contempt. "Do you even understand how hard it is to be with a man who doesn't even try to be better?" Those words were a punch to the gut. I stood there in the living room, unable to say anything in response. Her words were true, or at least that's what I thought then. My life felt like a series of failures. I woke up, went to work, came home, and drank to numb the pain. I hated myself for letting her turn me into this man. But I also knew that her words weren't really about me. They were about her. A few days after that conversation, I found a paper bag in our bedroom. Inside were receipts from an expensive restaurant and a bottle of perfume I had never seen her wear. I didn't know what to think. Maybe she bought it for herself? Or maybe it was a gift. But who gave it to her? I decided it was time to do something. After long deliberation, I set up a hidden camera in our living room. It was a hard decision. I felt like a traitor, but I also knew I needed to know the truth. I couldn't live in ignorance anymore. A week later, I watched the recordings for the first time. On the screen, I saw Emma bringing a man into our house. It was her boss, Tom. He was older than her, confident, with that smug smile that had always irritated me. They sat on the couch, laughing, drinking wine. Then they kissed. My heart stopped. I turned off the recording and sat down, covering my face with my hands. I didn't know what to do next. My life felt like shattered pieces scattered around me. I felt anger, but also shame. How had I let this happen? Why didn't I see it sooner? That night, I drank more than usual. All my plans to stop drinking vanished. I knew the next morning would hurt, but it was the only thing that dulled the pain in my chest. I sat in the dark room, listening to the silence. The home that once felt peaceful now felt foreign and cold. I decided I wasn't ready to act yet. I wanted more proof. I wanted everything to be clear. But deep down, I knew. When the moment came, I wouldn't be the same Jake anymore. In the morning, I woke up with a pounding head and a heavy heart. Last night's whiskey bottle still sat on the table, half empty. The air smelled of alcohol mixed with the scent of coffee Emma was making in the kitchen. Her voice carried through the door. "Jake, were you drinking again?" I didn't answer. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. My head throbbed, and only one image filled my thoughts. Her kiss with Tom. I replayed it over and over, like watching a movie, each scene bringing new pain. After Emma left for work, I sat in front of the screen again. I wanted to know more. I wanted to find answers. But as I watched the recordings, I only felt the ground opening into a bottomless void beneath me. The next few days, I went to work like a robot. My colleagues noticed I had become quieter, but no one said anything. I started avoiding people, shutting myself off. Even alcohol stopped providing temporary relief. On one of the recordings, I saw Emma hugging Tom in our bedroom. She was laughing, her voice sounding so tender, so carefree. I hadn't heard her sound like that in years. It seemed to me that she was truly herself only with him. I decided I had to talk to her, but I didn't know how. What could I say? That I had seen everything? That I had broken her trust by installing a camera? My hands trembled as I tried to imagine that conversation. The next morning, I gathered my strength. When Emma returned from work, I was sitting in the living room, waiting. She walked past me without stopping. Her bag landed on the floor, and her phone was immediately in her hand. "We need to talk," I said. She stopped and raised an eyebrow. "About what?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to say everything, but the words stuck in my throat. "You've changed, Emma," I whispered. She laughed, but it was a cold, almost sarcastic laugh. "Oh, you finally noticed? Jake, you've changed too. But not for the better." The conversation was short. She went to the bedroom, leaving me alone. At that moment, I realized that open confrontation would change nothing. Her contempt for me ran so deep that even my words couldn't touch her heart. I decided I needed to act differently. My next step was to find out more about Tom. I started searching for him on social media, browsing through his colleagues' pages. I discovered that he was a senior partner at the law firm where Emma worked. His life looked perfect. A successful career, expensive cars, prestigious vacations. But there was one fact that stunned me. Tom was married. His wife, Claire, seemed like a woman who had it all. Beauty, style, confidence. I looked at their shared photos and wondered if she knew that her husband spent his evenings in someone else's home. At that moment, I came up with a plan. The following week, I continued gathering recordings. Each new piece of evidence was a knife in my heart, but I couldn't stop. I wanted everything to be undeniable, clear. Finally, when I had collected enough material, I decided to take the first step. I sent Claire an anonymous message. In it, I briefly explained that her husband was cheating on her and suggested we meet. I didn't know if she would respond, but I felt I had to do it. That night, I was alone with my thoughts again. Emma came home late, without even explaining where she had been. I looked at her, and she felt like a stranger to me. Our marriage had become a ghost wandering through our home. I knew I was approaching the moment when everything would change. But was I ready for it? Could I be strong? Would I shatter completely? The reply to my message came the next morning. Claire wrote concisely, "I want to know the truth. Let's meet. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Bluebird Cafe." My heart raced. She was the first person who might understand my situation. We were both living in a world of lies created by Tom and Emma, but I had the chance to give her the truth she deserved. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early. My hands trembled as I held my coffee cup, my mind racing with thoughts of what I would say. Would she believe me? Would she see my words as an attack on her family? Claire arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. A tall, slender woman with determined features. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, and her gaze was piercingly cold. She spotted me immediately and walked over to the table. "You're Jacob?" she asked, sitting down across from me. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She studied me for a few seconds and then said, "Talk." I began by telling her about myself, about how I suspected Emma of cheating and decided to install a camera. At first, Claire listened silently, but when I showed her the recordings, her face grew tense. "This is our home," I said quietly, "and this is your husband." She stared at the screen for a long time without saying a word. Her fingers trembled as she closed the phone. Then she looked at me. "I knew Tom wasn't perfect. He loves drawing attention to himself. But I didn't think he would go this far," she said, leaning on the table. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the pain in every word. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "What are you doing?" she threw back at me. The question caught me off guard. The truth was, I didn't know. I had gathered all this evidence, but what now? Hand it to Emma? Start a scandal? I was a broken man who wanted justice but had no idea how to achieve it. "I want this to end," I finally said, "but I don't know how." Claire paused for a moment, then pulled a notebook from her bag and began to write something. "I have a plan," she said. "If you're willing to trust me, we'll make them both pay." I stared at her in surprise. There was a spark in her eyes that showed she was determined. "What do you want?" I asked. "The truth," she replied, "and for them to understand that actions have consequences." The feeling was strange. I suddenly realized I wasn't alone anymore. Here was someone who understood me, someone who was also hurt but hadn't lost the strength to fight. Claire explained her plan. She proposed organizing an accidental meeting that would be a real surprise for both Emma and Tom. We decided to proceed carefully so they wouldn't suspect anything. I began collecting even more evidence to make sure we had all the cards in our hands. When our conversation ended, Claire looked at me and said, "You're stronger than you think, Jake. Don't let them destroy you." Those words stayed with me even after I returned home. They were simple but, for some reason, significant. Maybe I really could change my life. That night, I went to bed with the thought that there was at least some hope on the horizon. But deep inside, anxiety gnawed at me. What if our plan didn't work? What if everything got even worse? The next day, I returned to my routine, but my thoughts constantly drifted back to my conversation with Claire. Her determination and cold confidence pushed me toward action. For the first time in a long time, I felt as though I could control the situation. Claire continued working on the plan, and we agreed not to rush. "It's important to do everything right," she said. During this time, I focused on my part of the task, gathering more evidence and monitoring Emma's behavior. Meanwhile, my relationship with Emma became even more strained. She barely spoke to me, except to demand something or express dissatisfaction. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table trying to work out our budget, she approached and said, "Jake, are you late with the bills again? Why do I always have to carry everything on my shoulders?" I gritted my teeth, trying not to explode. Images of her with Tom spun in my head. She was yelling at me, but I knew she was the one living a double life. "I'm working on it," I replied dryly. "Working? You can't even hold down a proper job. You're a security guard, Jake. A security guard." Her words were like slaps to my face. I didn't respond. Her words didn't affect me like they used to. Maybe it was because I knew that soon everything would change. Meanwhile, Claire had found a way to get to Tom. She started by sending him a message, pretending to be one of his acquaintances. She knew how to play a role, and, judging by everything, Tom had no idea his wife knew about his affair. He responded almost immediately, she told me during our next meeting. "He relies too much on his charm. He thinks he can fool me just like everyone else." Her plan was simple but effective. She wanted to organize a dinner where both Emma and Tom would appear simultaneously, but not as a couple. And this was supposed to be a surprise for both of them. "I want them to see their lies collapse right before their eyes," she explained. I agreed, though anxiety gnawed at me from within. I wasn't sure if I could handle it. Seeing Emma with Tom in that situation would mean facing all my fears and pain head-on. In the meantime, my tension grew. I started drinking more than usual, though I tried to avoid it. One evening, when Emma came home later than usual, I couldn't hold back and asked, "Were you with Tom?" She froze for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "What? You're drunk, Jake. You don't even know what you're talking about." "I know more than you think," I shot back, but her eyes held nothing but defiance. She wasn't afraid of me anymore, if she ever had been. The next day, I told Claire about the incident. She just shook her head. "They're certain we won't find out anything. That makes our plan even better." D-Day was scheduled for the following week. Claire and I meticulously planned every detail so our betrayers wouldn't suspect anything until the last moment. I could feel my anxiety mixing with the anticipation of something significant. I knew this would be the night that changed everything. But was I ready for it? The evening Claire and I had been waiting for finally arrived. The venue had been chosen carefully. A cozy but popular restaurant in the city center. Claire had arranged the invitations so that neither Tom nor Emma knew who else would be there. It was meant to be their surprise. I sat in my car outside the restaurant, wondering if I was doing the right thing. No matter what happened, I knew everything would change after that night. But could I live with the consequences? Would the weight of the truth crush me? Claire was already inside, ready to play her role. She'd chosen a corner table where we could observe them while staying in the shadows. Tom arrived first. His confident stride, expensive attire, and flawless smile betrayed a man who believed the world was in his pocket. Emma appeared a few minutes later. She looked as if she were going on a date. Her black dress accentuated her figure, and her makeup was perfectly done. It hit me hard that she didn't put half as much effort into our evenings at home. When Emma saw Tom, her face lit up with joy. She approached and hugged him, but the gesture revealed more than simple friendship. I felt my hands clench into fists, but Claire placed a calming hand on my shoulder. "Steady, Jake," she whispered. "We'll wait." We didn't rush to reveal ourselves. At first, I watched them interact. Their conversation was light, even playful. They flirted, and Tom placed his hand on hers. I felt a tightness in my chest. Claire gave me the signal and we stood up. This was the moment I had both feared and awaited. We walked to their table, and the first thing I noticed was the shock on their faces. "What's this little show?" Tom blurted out. Emma was silent, her wide eyes locked on me, unable to look away. "A show?" Claire sat down beside him. "Oh, Tom, I haven't even begun." Emma tried to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she stared at me. I wanted to say everything I'd bottled up over the past months. All the pain, the anger, the disappointment, but I stayed silent. Claire pulled out her phone and began showing a video. Tom turned pale as he saw himself in our bedroom. Emma covered her face with her hands, her body looking fragile and broken. "How could you?" My voice finally broke out. It sounded hollow, but it carried everything. Pain, anger, humiliation. "After everything I did for you? Jake, She started, but I raised my hand to stop her. "You don't have the right to justify yourself, Emma." Claire, meanwhile, stared calmly at Tom. "And you, Tom? Do you know what will happen when your colleagues and clients find out about this?" Her voice was as cold as ice. "I don't think your career will survive." "You won't do that, Claire," he said, trying to maintain his composure. But there was panic in his eyes. "Try me." I stood up from the table. Everything I needed to say had been said. "I'll leave you two with this. You deserve each other." Emma began to cry, but I couldn't find any sympathy for her. These were her choices, her decisions, and now she would have to live with the consequences. Claire followed me outside. On the street, she stopped and said, "This was just the beginning. Now it's time to move on, Jake." Her words were right, but could I really do it? My wounds were too fresh, the pain too sharp. I returned home and opened a bottle of whiskey. This time, the alcohol brought no relief, only emptiness. That night, I sat in a dark room and thought about what would come next. The days following the meeting at the restaurant felt like a fever dream. Emma avoided me, as if afraid to look me in the eye. She would come home late, say almost nothing, and look like she was about to break. I didn't care. My heart, which once beat for her, was now filled with cold emptiness. Claire didn't give me much time to dwell on it. She kept pressuring Tom, sending him copies of the recordings and messages with short hints. "You won't be able to hide this." I didn't ask why she was doing it, and I didn't interfere. She acted as she saw fit, and it seemed her strength helped sustain my own. One evening, when I came home, I saw Emma in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with a glass of wine, barely touching it with her lips. "We need to talk," she said without lifting her eyes. I didn't respond and walked into the living room, turning on the TV. Her words no longer had any power over me. "Jake, please don't ignore me." She came closer, her voice quiet, almost pleading. "What do you want, Emma?" I asked coldly, not turning to face her. "I made a mistake. I know that. But you're not without faults either." Those words made me pause. I turned to her, looking straight into her eyes. "Not without faults? You cheated on me in my own house, Emma. You didn't even try to hide it. And now you want to justify yourself by pointing out my flaws. You were never perfect, Jake." Her voice rose, tinged with anger. "You drink, you shut yourself off, you don't even try to be part of our life." I laughed, but the laugh was bitter. "There was never in our life, Emma. There was your life. I just existed in it like a shadow." She didn't respond. Her shoulders slumped, and I saw tears welling in her eyes. Once that would have broken me, but not now. Now those tears were just a reminder of how deeply she had betrayed me. "Jake, I want to try to fix this," she said quietly. "But I need time." "You already had your time," I replied, turning back to the TV. "And you spent it on someone else." Emma left the kitchen, and I heard the door to her bedroom close. That sound carried more emotion than all our conversations over the past months. The next day, I met with Claire again. We sat in the same cafe where we had first discussed our plan. She looked tired but satisfied. "Tom broke," she said, stirring her coffee. "He tried to convince me not to tell his partners about everything. He offered me money. And what did you say?" "I told him I don't want money. I want justice." Her voice was firm. "Do you think he realizes it's all over?" I asked. "I think he does, but it's too late." I nodded. Now that Tom and Emma were forced to face the truth, their world had begun to collapse. But did that make me happy? When I got home that evening, I found Emma in an unusual state. She was sitting on the couch, holding a bottle of wine, looking completely shattered. Her eyes were red, and her hair disheveled. "Jake," she said when I entered. Her voice was so quiet I barely heard it. "What do you want?" I asked, not hiding my exhaustion. She began to cry, sobbing so hard her words were lost. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I could see that she regretted everything. I want to fix this," she finally whispered. But did I want her to fix it? Was that even possible? The days grew heavier. Emma and I drifted further apart, but her attempts to fix everything didn't stop. She started seeing a therapist, trying to find reasons for her actions, though I didn't see much point in what she was doing. Claire also continued her game with Tom, but I increasingly felt that she wasn't just seeking revenge anymore. She had begun to enjoy it. I withdrew into myself, distanced from everything. At work, I had no significant achievements, but it no longer mattered. All I wanted was to forget everything. Yet not a day passed without me thinking about the betrayal, about how I had been broken and tossed aside. Claire suggested meeting a few more times to discuss the strategy for the final blow. She had already begun delving into legal matters, figuring out how to make Tom lose everything he had. But so what? Why did this matter to me? What did I gain from these games? One day, I went to a bar to forget, even if just for a few hours. Alcohol was my old friend, and though it didn't solve any problems, it offered temporary relief. I sat at a table, downing shot after shot of vodka, when I noticed someone familiar at the other end of the bar. It was Emma. She was sitting there with a man I had never seen before, and their behavior made me sick. She laughed, touched his hand, and he responded with warm glances. It was another betrayal, but this time it wasn't mine. I had no claim over her anymore, and yet, it broke my heart even more than her betrayal with Tom. I got up and walked toward them. It was an automatic decision born of loss and anger. Approaching their table, I felt like everything was dragging me down, like a stone in water. "Emma," I said, my voice trembling slightly, though I tried to hold myself together. "You haven't stopped humiliating me, even when we're no longer together." She looked up, and on her face appeared that same shadow of surprise and shame I had seen during our first meeting after her betrayal. "Jake," her voice was almost hoarse, "I didn't think you'd be here. You thought I'd just give up, didn't you?" I couldn't stop myself. "You just moved on, living your life. But we both know that's not true. You keep lying, even when there's nothing left." The man she was with moved back when he realized the tension in the situation. Emma seemed uncomfortable but didn't apologize. She just remained silent, her gaze lost in something distant. I couldn't believe this was the same woman with whom I had once built plans for the future, whom I loved, who had become my nightmare. I returned to the bar and ordered another drink. All those thoughts of revenge, betrayal, anger, it was all too heavy for me now. That night, as always, I returned home alone. There were no more pleas from Emma, no attempts on her part to talk. Her absence had become my new reality. I sat in my dark apartment, which felt more like a box, and tried again to forget, drinking and drinking. The next day, I met with Claire again. She wasn't surprised when she heard about my encounter with Emma at the bar. She knew what had happened, though she couldn't imagine how I felt afterward. "You did what you had to," Claire said, looking me in the eye. "But you've already decided you don't want to be part of this world anymore, haven't you?" I didn't reply. What could I say? My soul was empty, and no revenge, no battle won would bring me peace. Now I just remained among my ruins, surrounded by people who were no longer mine. They were strangers, and I couldn't return to who I used to be. Each day was just a new stage in my fall. I no longer knew whether Claire wanted to continue with her plans, or if it even mattered anymore. Everything had lost meaning. I was now just a shadow of the man who once loved and believed. Several weeks passed since that night at the bar, and although everything seemed to remain the same, inside me there was nothing left. All my hopes that something might change, that I could return to the life I once had, melted like snow under a burning sun. I began to lose my sense of time. The days became identical to one another, like gray shadows trailing behind me with every step. I went to work, but it was only to avoid sinking deeper into the emptiness. Claire sometimes called or texted, reminding me that we needed to finalize our plan against Tom, but I no longer cared. The idea of revenge no longer drove me. It was empty and futile, like everything else in my life. Emma didn't call or write. She disappeared the same way she had entered my life, quickly, without any warnings. Only occasionally did I see her in a store or on the street, and every time my heart clenched. She was always distant, almost absent when her gaze accidentally met mine. But I was no longer the man who could forgive her. And even if I wanted to, did I have the strength? I didn't even try to sort out my feelings. It would have been pointless. Alcohol had once again become my only friend, my lifeline in this ocean of pain. I would come home, drink, and for a while everything around me would quiet down. But that calm was temporary. The next morning, I woke up with a new bitter feeling in my soul and a blank stare. One day, after yet another argument with Claire, when she was once again trying to push me toward going after Tom, I realized that I no longer wanted to be part of this world. I didn't want to play these games anymore, didn't want to prove anything to anyone. I decided to leave. I packed a few things and left. I just left, without plans, without goals, just to escape it all. I ended up in a small town, far from the bustle. It was a place where no one knew me, where I could finally be alone, without unwanted eyes and questions. The town was calm. There were no unnecessary people, and even having lunch at a cafe table felt like a soothing routine. But even here, I couldn't escape my thoughts. They were with me no matter where I went. Claire tried to contact me. She sent texts, called. She didn't stop until I blocked her on every platform. I didn't care what she thought. She had her own plans, her own ideas about how everything should be, but I was no longer part of those plans. Just like Emma, Claire was part of my past, and although that past still hurt, I couldn't allow myself to live in it. I slowly started rebuilding my life, though I knew it would never be what it once was. My heart could no longer be open to others, and it probably never would be. Since then, I had become only a shadow of the man I once was. But sometimes I remember how things could have been different. If I hadn't been the way I am, if I hadn't allowed what happened, if I hadn't let myself sink into alcohol, hadn't let myself be humiliated, maybe everything would have been different. But these what-ifs changed nothing. I sat in a cafe, staring at my hands holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The pain I lived with had become my constant companion, and I didn't know how much longer I had left. Maybe tomorrow everything would change. Maybe not. But I no longer searched for answers. 3 months passed, but the feeling of emptiness never left me. I left the city where everything seemed to be falling apart and moved to a small coastal town. Here, life flowed slowly, and I had a chance to calm down a little. But the shadows of the past still wouldn't let me go. Emma didn't call, but Claire still tried to remind me of herself. She sent messages, asked how I was, sometimes mentioning that Tom could still pay for his mistakes. But I no longer cared. I didn't want to return to that life, even if it meant restoring some sense of justice. One day, I ran into an old acquaintance at a cafe, John, who had once worked with me at the security company. He was one of those I had considered a friend, though we hadn't seen each other in years. John looked like he, too, had recently been through something difficult. He smiled when he saw me and invited me to sit down. "How are you?" he asked as I sat down. "Same as always," I replied, though in truth, I didn't know what to say. My life had been scattered into pieces, and I had no desire to share anything. "What happened with you and that woman?" John asked, sensing that something had occurred. I stayed silent, unwilling to explain all those years of pain, failures, and betrayals. I wasn't ready to relive it all again. "She betrayed me," I said simply. "Only now I know it's not worth searching for justice. It won't bring me back." John looked at me carefully and understood that I wasn't going to continue this conversation. He, too, had clearly been through something similar because he didn't push. We drank coffee in silence. each of us left alone with our thoughts. A few days later, after another night spent with alcohol, I decided to finally take a step toward feeling alive again. I signed up for training, started going to the gym, trying to rebuild the muscles that had once supported my body. But even physical activity couldn't bring me inner peace. I was still too broken to believe I could start over with a clean slate. That evening, when I got home, I found a letter on the table. It was a short note from Claire. "Tom has lost everything, and you can take part of it, but it's your choice." I didn't know whether it was worth reading at all. My ability to react to such situations had dulled. But, unable to resist, I read it again. It was the same old thing: revenge, compensation, money. But I was no longer the man who needed such trivialities. All I wanted was peace, though I knew it was unattainable. And so I made a decision. My thoughts would no longer revolve around betrayal and revenge. I wasn't going to search for ways to return to the past. My reality was here, in this quiet town, and I chose to accept it, even if it meant being alone. I began another chapter of my life. Maybe it was just a new stage, no greater or lesser than the one before, but I started listening to myself more. I didn't look for blame or justification. I decided I would move forward, even if it meant being alone. Every day I woke up with a sense of calm. I no longer waited for calls from Emma or Claire, didn't try to figure out who was at fault. I began to rediscover myself in what was left of my old self. At first, it was simple things: working out at the gym, morning runs, sometimes reading books I hadn't touched in years. I realized how important it was to return to things that didn't depend on other people. But still, one night, I heard a knock at the door. The feeling I experienced in that moment was familiar. It was the call I had been waiting for so long. But when I opened the door, I saw her, Emma. When I opened the door, Emma stood before me. Her face was gaunt, and her eyes were red from crying. She looked like she had been through hell. In her hands was a small package, but I didn't even look at it. Only one question escaped my lips. "What do you want, Emma?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stood there in silence until her breathing steadied. Then she said, "I came to apologize." I didn't know what to feel. There was no longer the bitterness that had once consumed me at the sight of her. Instead, I felt only cold emptiness. Why now? Why after everything? Emma shrugged and said that she couldn't bear it anymore. She placed the package on the table and left, not waiting for my reaction. I stood there, staring at the door as it closed, feeling how she was leaving me again. Only this time with a sense of regret. When I looked inside the package, there were a few photographs. Old photographs of her and me together, laughing, loving each other. She had left me a piece of the past that no longer had any weight. Time had passed and we had changed. Leaving the package on the table, I sat there for a long time, reflecting. Emma had come to apologize, but what did it mean to me? Everything had already been said. Everything had already been lost. I realized that even her apology couldn't bring back what I had lost. Those photographs were just a reminder of what I once had but no longer wanted. I was no longer that man, and this chapter of my life had closed, even if I didn't want to admit it. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't think about Emma or Claire. I thought only about myself. All those years I had spent searching for justice, or even revenge, now seemed pointless. I finally understood that my healing would no longer come from words or apologies. I sat in the silence of my room, staring into the night. It was calm, but there was still pain within me. Not from what had happened, but from the fact that I had allowed this pain to be a part of me for so long. I decided that I would no longer cling to the past. I wouldn't search for explanations, nor wait for someone to change. From now on, I would live by my own rules. A few days after Emma's visit, I saw John again. He noticed that I looked calmer. "How are you feeling?" he asked. I smiled at him, even if it was just a fake smile. "It doesn't matter anymore," I replied. "I've realized that the only thing I have to do is forgive myself." It was hard to accept all my mistakes and understand that I was partly to blame for what had happened. But I could no longer allow myself to carry that heavy burden. I no longer wanted to remain in the past. John looked at me and then nodded his head. "That's the right decision," he said, and we both fell silent, each lost in our own thoughts. Time passed, and I gradually adjusted to my new reality. I started traveling, discovering new places. It became my way of starting over, even though I still felt emptiness inside. But I no longer waited for the return of what I had lost. I knew that some things couldn't be brought back, and even if I longed for them, I was no longer the man who needed them. I simply became a part of a new world. Each day brought me new opportunities, and though the pain from past relationships sometimes resurfaced, I knew that I alone determined my destiny. One morning, sitting in a cafe in a new city, I noticed a familiar face. It was Claire. She walked in, stopped, saw me, and froze. I didn't know what she was doing there. She was alone, without Tom, without the smile that had once seemed so convincing. We locked eyes, and I saw in hers the same confusion I had felt when I left her. She didn't approach me immediately. Only after a few minutes, she sat at a nearby table, ordered coffee, and began watching me from a distance. Her presence didn't surprise me, but deep inside, I felt a strange stir. It was that moment when the whole story became relevant again. But I no longer had any need to figure it out. Claire took a few steps toward me and sat across from me. "I know you don't want to see me anymore," she said without hesitation. "But I just wanted to apologize. I realize you didn't believe my apologies back then, but now I know I was wrong." I looked at her, unsure of what to say. What could I say to someone who had once been my world, but now was nothing? "You don't need to apologize," I said. "We both made our choices, and we have to live with the consequences." Claire nodded silently. The sadness I remembered so well appeared in her eyes once again. She left a few coins on the table and walked out. I remained seated, watching her leave, and for a moment, I felt how hard it was to remain indifferent. A few days after meeting Claire, I felt as though I had finally let go of all the pain I had carried inside. Instead of holding on to resentment and unforgiveness, I accepted that everything that happened was part of my journey. My decisions, my mistakes, all those losses, they were parts of me, and I could no longer avoid them. That evening, I went to a local park and just sat on a bench, watching the sun set beyond the horizon. It was a moment of silence when I finally felt at peace. I no longer searched for someone to blame, nor did I hold on to anger. Only peace remained within me, and though I knew the pain might return, I was no longer afraid. I had learned to forgive not others but myself. A few weeks later, I met a woman. She was completely different, calm, mature, without pretense. We just talked, laughed, and spent the evening together, with no grand expectations of each other. It was simply a moment when I realized I could open my heart again, but this time without the frantic fear of being betrayed. The woman I met wasn't perfect, but she didn't demand anything from me that I couldn't give. And that was exactly what I needed, not perfection, but authenticity. We started seeing each other more, but I wasn't rushing. I didn't want to make the same mistake again. I didn't want to tie myself to something that could break my heart again. But this time, I felt like it could be something good, even though unpredictable. A few months later, I realized that everything that had happened in my life was necessary for me to become who I am now. My past relationships, the pain and disappointments had left their mark, but they didn't define me. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't the kind of man who accepts everything as it comes. I became someone who had learned to appreciate the moment without looking back. I had no regrets. My story was part of my journey, and it was exactly what I needed to go through. And in that moment, I understood. I was ready to let go, not out of revenge or disappointment, but because I realized that true forgiveness isn't for others. It's for yourself. So, I left the past behind and looked to the future with hope, even though I knew life would continue to bring its challenges. But now I was ready for them, and so my story ended. Now, when I look back, I realize that even in the darkest moments, I wasn't alone. We all go through painful things in life, but every choice, every decision on the path to healing brings a new perspective. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding the strength to move forward without allowing the past to define our future. I know my feelings weren't unique, but was my path the right one? And can we truly forgive when our heart has already endured such deep pain? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've ever been in a similar situation, would you be able to forgive? Leave me a comment. I'd really like to know what you think about this.